Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Dagda's Daughter from the Raven and Hummingbird series, Book 2 by Nikki, Broadwell, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. A present filled with a sense of loss, a life deadened by the Celtic Dagda's whims. Ravens flit through her memory, reminding Cattell of something, a past she cannot recall. Dagda is Cattell's father, a being without scruples who has decided to take what he wants and damn the consequences. With his decision to leave Otherworld to live among humans, he has brought a spreading darkness that has now infiltrated the crossroads where the two realms intersect. What once was beautiful has become dangerous, forces never seen before finding their way up from the depths and into the light. With his treachery, Dagda has loosed a future so bleak that not only Otherworld but also Earth will succumb. But what he doesn't know is that Cattell is far more powerful than he ever could have dreamed. Her destiny is entwined with his, and her fate is to untangle the unnatural threads he has knotted together. But in order to do that, she must remember everything. Chapter 1. Dagda gazed out the picture window that overlooked the city, admiring the view. Brick and glass arts and craft style architecture dotted the cityscape, the buildings adding a special grace to the vista. It was nearly as beautiful as Otherworld, he thought to himself. The leaves of mature oaks and sycamore trees swayed in the breeze, cloud shadows racing across an otherwise pellucid sky. He smiled, his mind returning as it always did to his perfect situation. Being the CEO of a major corporation was what he'd been born to do. It had taken him all of 5 minutes to convince the ones in charge that he was the man for the job. Being a god living on Earth definitely had its perks. Since that fateful day, he'd bought the company, ousting those he didn't like and replacing them with men he'd handpicked for the job, mercenaries out for money who would do his bidding. A soft knock brought him out of his reverie. "Come," he bellowed, moving behind his desk. "Sorry to disturb you, sir," the mousy, bespectacled woman murmured, moving into the room. "But we have a situation that requires your attention." She moved forward to place a sheaf of papers on his desk. "First quarter earnings are looking good, but there is one slight hitch." "And what is that?" he asked, glancing down at the papers. "New competition, sir. We are no longer the only game in town." "Well, in that case," he said, frowning, "get a hold of the team and set up a meeting for this afternoon." "Yes, sir," she said, backing out and closing the door behind her. Dagda pressed his lips together and shook his head. Humans were so quick to fear the worst. Luckily, the men and women he'd handpicked for his team were a bunch of cutthroats who only cared about the bottom line. In this world, corporations were where the power was solidified, power that could be used politically. He chuckled, thinking about the Congress that now ate out of his hand. If he ran for president, he would win, hands down. When the Celtic knot ring on his finger caught the light, he had a moment of misgiving, his thoughts going to his wife, Shobin. She was heavy with his child, the second one he'd bestowed upon her. Shobin had little memory of the first life the two of them had shared together, or the baby girl she'd given birth to. In her mind, the baby she carried was her first, and he'd made her young again in her best childbearing years. Despite the woman being his creation, she retained her earlier sweetness and sense of right and wrong. Thank goodness this try had worked. His first try at resurrection had failed miserably, causing problems he was still dealing with. He imagined her in his mind's eye, her beautiful hazel eyes and sweet smile. His heart contracted with love, the feelings for her overwhelming in their intensity. If she ever discovered the treachery that ran rampant through his company, she would be furious with him. Luckily, she didn't know anything about what he really did, her innate trust giving him free rein to conduct his life as he saw fit. From there, his mind turned to Cattell, his first child with Shobin. He'd bound her goddess powers and taken away her memories of the man she loved. Bran was a god, but not one Dagda wanted as a son-in-law or the father of his grandchildren. Bran was too soft, too loving. Cattell needed a stronger man, one who could navigate this world that was turning darker and more evil with each passing day. Power was the name of the game, and whoever Cat ended up with needed to be an expert at playing it. Several suitable candidates came to mind. He could think of at least 2 men in his employ who were the right age and handsome and smart enough to fit the bill. She will be better off, he told himself, trying to rationalize what he'd done and was planning to do. Although living in another city, he spied on her from time to time. He had to bind her powers more often now that she turned 22. She seemed happy enough, but why she had a preteen boy living with her was perplexing. How had that come about? He would have to investigate further and find out what was going on. He had noticed that she was more difficult to locate these days, and when he did find her, he had to use stronger magic to constrain her strength. He chuckled, thinking about what a mighty goddess she would make if he ever unbound her powers. But when that would be, he didn't know. Perhaps never, if his life work here continued the way he hoped. Soon, he would be a father again with another half-god child, a boy, and this time he would be around to raise him. He still felt constriction around his chest whenever he thought about Cattell, some remaining guilt always rising up in him until he slammed it back where it belonged. He let out a humorless chuckle. Is Cat my conscience? I was nicer back then, he thought, trying to let go of the shame that always accompanied his forays into the past. Luckily, the team chose that moment to arrive, their entrance into his office bringing his attention back to the present. He breathed out a heavy sigh and turned to deal with the problem at hand. Chapter 2. What on earth have you done? Cat stared at the mangy sheepdog eating from a bowl in her tiny kitchen. Brant looked up from where he kneeled next to the black and white mutt, looked as though it had fleas. Thought you needed an animal, he said with a grin. Too quiet around here. For you, maybe, Cat replied, staring at her 12-year-old charge. Why had she agreed to take this boy on? It had been less than a month, and already he'd become her shadow. And when he wasn't dogging her every single place she went, he was doing things like this. According to Gwen, her boss, who had arranged for Brant to live with her, the kid had no prospects, his drug-addicted mother living on the street. He didn't act like any kid she'd ever known, with his extensive vocabulary and self-assurance. How could a child brought up in a homeless shelter and out in the woods by an uneducated drug addict know so much? She let out a heavy sigh. I'm not home enough to have a dog, Brant. Is he even housebroken? It's a female, and yes, she is. What shall we name her? Cat frowned and turned to put her groceries away. If we keep her, she's your responsibility. That's fine by me. Does that mean I get to name her too? Cat shoved a head of lettuce, asparagus, and a hunk of cheese into the refrigerator. Whatever, she said, distracted as she always was by the strange emotions that often plagued her when she was in the presence of this boy. Before she knew what was happening, he had thrown his arms around her and was pressed against her in a hug. Thank you, Cat, he murmured. Cat extricated herself and tried not to notice how her body felt. For God's sake, Cat, he's 12 years, she told herself, wondering what in hell was wrong with her. He was mature for his age, and she could see how handsome he would be when he reached adulthood, but that didn't change his current age and her role as mother. When she glanced at him, he was watching her as though he could read her thoughts, his mouth turned slightly up at the corners. It's the eyes, she thought to herself, that gorgeous mossy color, and the way he looks at me sometimes as though he's in love with me. She shook herself mentally. What shall we have for dinner tonight? Brant did one shoulder shrug and ran his hands through his tangled mass of shoulder-length hair. How about you take a shower before we eat, okay? Cat suggested. Brant let out a chortle. Whatever you say, Mom. I'm not... He waved a hand in the air. I know. You're not my mom. I would have been 10 when you were born. He let out a laugh. Her name is Puka. What? The dog's name is Puka. She just told me. Ha ha. Very funny, but it's a good enough name. Oh, crap. Did I just agree to keep it? Yes, I think you did. Cat stared at him. Are you a mind reader? A flush moved into his cheeks. Sometimes I don't know what you'd call it. I just know things. You're psychic. He shrugged. Maybe. Mom always said I knew what she was going to say before she said it. Cat waved him away. Go take your shower and get out of my hair. Once Brant was out of the kitchen, she let out a sigh of relief. It was hard having him around all the time. She barely had a moment to herself now, what with him coming into her Seardwin's cosmetic cauldron where she worked and tagging after her when she took a walk or went to collect herb in the bigger forest outside the city. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been alone. At night, when she crawled into bed, was the only time she had to herself. And because she lived in a studio apartment, even that wasn't really private, with him sleeping on the couch behind the screen she'd bought. How did Gwen talk me into this? She asked herself for the millionth time. She'd just begun to date Cedar, the worst timing ever. And yet, here she was. The dog gave a bark, startling out of her reverie. She'd completely forgotten about Puka. "A bath and a flea dip," she whispered, reaching down to rub behind the dog's ears. Brant's tenor voice wafted from the bathroom, the words of the song he sang strange and unintelligible. Were all 12-year-olds as odd as he was? 15 minutes later, Brant arrived in the kitchen, his hair wet and a towel wrapped around his hips. Did he delight in making her uncomfortable? "Something smells good," he said, leaving drips across the floor as he moved to the stove where she was preparing an impromptu curry. "Go get dressed," she told him, making sure not to look into those luminous eyes. "Yes, ma'am." She turned just in time to see him removing the towel, wondering if he did these little shows to embarrass her. Modesty was not in his vocabulary. When his eyes met hers, she turned quickly away, her cheeks flaming. Chapter 3. "He's so strange," Kat whispered into Gwen's ear. Gwen was her boss, the owner of Seardwin's cosmetic cauldron, the natural face product store where she'd worked for nearly a year now. It was Gwen who had arranged for Brant to come live with Kat, citing his mother's inability to care for him and counting on Kat's soft heart. In reality, the white-haired crone was Seardwin, the goddess of transformation and inspiration, something that Kat had sort of known at one time, but since her memories had been stripped, she no longer remembered, along with many other things. "What has he done?" Gwen asked innocently. Kat glanced back toward the back room where she'd left Brant, hoping he was busy doing the assignments in the notebooks Gwen had provided. "He's like flirting or trying to embarrass me or something." Gwen chuckled. "Typical 12-year-old boy." Kat glanced toward the arched opening as Brant emerged. "Can we go collect herbs now? I'm bored," he whined. "Not yet," Kat replied, turning to Gwen, who for some reason was here today. Normally she managed the store on her own, and she liked it that way. "Go," Gwen said, waving a hand. "I have to do the taxes." "I wondered why you were here." Gwen smiled at the boy. "Make sure you keep her safe," she said, winking. Brant grinned the grin that always lit up his already beautiful eyes. "I always do," he replied. Kat frowned at the two of them. She knew it was a running joke between them, but the idea of him taking care of her was ludicrous. "We have a dog now to take over that job," she muttered, clapping her hands. A second later, Puka appeared from the back room, her gaze expectant. Her fur was smooth, all mats and fleas gone. With Brant's help, Kat had bathed her in flea-rid shampoo. Her coat still looked a bit dull, but with the good diet she was on, she would soon be her shiny self. "I need lavender and chamomile," Gwen said, "and if you can find it, some hazel bark. Too early for rose hips." It was late spring now, the roses just beginning to bloom. The often absent sun was out today, and Kat longed to be in the woods far from the city, but having a companion along who talked incessantly was not her favorite thing. "I'll get what I can." She pulled out her phone and called the number for Uber. "I'm going over there," Brant told her once they arrived at the hardwood forest near the homeless camp on the edge of the city. Kat gazed at where he pointed. "But that's the homeless camp." "Yeah, I know. I like talking to them." "I'll take Puka with me then." Brant nodded. "She knows what to do." "Really? How do you know that?" "Because she's not really a dog. She's more like a protection spirit." Kat laughed. "You are too much." He shrugged and headed off, his hands deep in the pockets of his low-slung shorts. "Okay, it's you and me," Kat whispered, taking a trail she knew. It led into what she liked to think of as the magical part of the forest, the place where she could swear she heard fairies and tiny creatures whispering. The sun always shone there, despite what the weather was up to everywhere else. She couldn't remember how she discovered this place. Someone had brought her here and led her down these shadowy trails to locate special herbs, but for some reason, the person was nameless and faceless, a blank in her memory. Puka loped ahead, floppy ears alert as she stopped to sniff this or that. She had to be part sheepdog with her long black and white fur and intelligent brown eyes. Cat hurried down the trail that Puka chose, not surprised when she came to a cleared area with chamomile growing. She bent to add it to the basket slung over her arm. It was so nice to be on her own for a change, where she could think and process all that had happened this past month. But instead of processing, she was overtaken by a vision. She was with Brant, but he was older, closer to her own age. He was handsome and attentive. His arms were around her waist as they walked together under the trees. She knew they were heading toward a pond where they would strip off their clothes and go skinny dipping, and after that they would make love in the tall grass. Puka's bark snapped her out of it. She shivered, her heart pounding. The idea of making love with the kid she was raising was disgusting and immoral. It was barely 10 seconds later that a man was standing in front of her, the same one who'd bothered her several times in the past. But she hadn't seen him in a while, and never here. He was white-shouldered and barrel-chested with coal-black hair and piercing eyes the color of the sky just before the stars appeared. Puka snapped her at his legs, her mouth curled back in an angry snarl. When the man kicked at her, Cat shouted, "Leave her alone!" He moved closer, his hands making intricate patterns as his eyes pinned her like a bug. From her past experiences, she knew that if she didn't run right now, she'd be rooted to the spot until he was finished with her. She moved backward away from him, stumbling in her haste. And when Puka distracted him, taking his gaze from hers, she turned and ran. Behind her, Puka's growls grew even more ferocious, the man shouting at her in a language Cat couldn't understand. She heard the thunk of his boot connecting with Puka, the whimper that came afterward. Tears were streaming down her face by the time she burst out of the forest and sprinted to where Brant stood, talking with a dark-haired woman. They both turned, worried looks on their faces. "What's wrong?" Brant asked. "A man," she gasped. "The guy who's bothered me before. He's in the forest, and I think he hurt Puka." "The dog will be fine," the woman said with an expression of certainty. Cat stared at the stranger. "Where is she, then?" "Here she comes," Brant called, running toward the dog, who loped toward them. "Good girl," he whispered, rubbing her ears. "See?" the woman said, smiling. Cat took a closer look at the stranger who had befriended her charge. She was probably in her 30s, brown hair filled with leaves and twigs and tangled around her angular face. She was barefoot, a bunch of small leather pouches attached to the leather belt she was wearing around her loose brown tunic. She had the look of a sprite who lived in the trees, a goddess of the forest. Was she a member of the homeless camp? "My name's Ermid. I live here. I can help you find the herbs you're looking for. You were lucky today. So I suggest you take a buddy next time." "Do you know who that man is?" Ermid's eyes narrowed. "He is a bad man who wishes to do you harm. If you manage to keep away from him, he'll lose interest." I don't get it. Lose interest in what?" Ermid and Brant exchanged a look. "In harming you, of course. I've seen his kind before." "He's like my dad was. He wants to control over everything," Brant added. "You never mentioned your dad. Where does he live?" He lifted one shoulder. I don't know, and I don't want to know." Cat glanced at Ermid. "How do you two know each other?" "Didn't Brant tell you? He and his mom lived at our homeless camp for a while." Brant smiled, watching her. "Yeah, Ermid and my mom are friends." Cat had a sort of deja vu feeling for a moment before she pulled out her cell phone and punched in the numbers for an Uber to take them home. When the car arrived 20 minutes later, Cat headed toward it, her back to the conversation going on between Ermid and Brant. "I'm going crazy," she heard Brant say. "If something doesn't happen soon, I'm telling her." "Don't do that. If he gets any inkling that you're around, he'll do something even more drastic." "How did he fucking find us today? I've put up every protection spell I know." When Cat reached the car, she turned to look back at them. She was at least 100 feet away, and she could still hear them as if they were standing right next to her. And what in the world were they talking about? She climbed in the back seat and waited, watching Ermid give Brant a hug before he sprinted toward the car with Puka right on his heels. Sorry, she thinks of me like her son, he said, climbing into the back seat next to her. You both know that man, don't you? She whispered as the driver did a U-turn and took off down the gravel road. Brant blenched. Yes, if he's the one I think he is. He used to raid our camp when Mom and I lived here. He's dangerous. And what are you, some sort of magician? She scoffed. Protection spell? He frowned. You were too far away to hear me clearly. What I said was Puka is protecting you. Kat knew what she heard, wondering why he was lying. What is it you threatened to tell me? Tell you? His eyes widened in innocence. Yes, tell me. I heard you say that if something doesn't happen soon. Oh, that, he chuckled. I was talking about my mom. She promised to come see me and she hasn't done it yet. Kat stared at him. Whatever, Brant, but I don't tolerate lying. The rest of the trip was made in silence.